Hello and welcome to our Year 11 study guide. The purpose of this presentation is to support parents in knowing how best to support their children. So during this presentation I will be speaking as though I'm speaking to parents. It would be very useful for you to be sharing this presentation with your son or daughter so that everybody is clear on the advice that's being given and the best way, therefore, to work during this year to succeed the very best results in the summer. It may be that at the moment, when you're speaking to your son or daughter, these are the sort of excuses or the sort of reasons which are being given for why revision is not going as well as it might be. I don't want to go through them all, and it may be that you haven't heard all of these, just some of them. But whatever it is, we're hoping that during the course of this presentation we'll be able to help you in supporting your child to do better, whichever of these things is causing them a problem. So what we're going to be focusing on this evening is what should they be doing and what can you do to help them to do that. Indeed, I'm going to go a bit further than that, and I'm assuming that since you're watching this presentation, you're prepared to have advice given to you. I may even be saying what should you be doing as well as what could you be doing. And in some cases, it's important that you understand that all the answers are not going to be given in this presentation, but there are other places you can go for extra support or help if that's what's needed. So there are a number of stages in the advice that we're going to give you. First of all, the recognition that during the course of this year there's an important balance to be struck between the work that students need to do on an ongoing basis and the revision that they need to do in preparation for the GCSE exams in the summer. There's preparation for studying, there's actually learning information, there's using that information in order to do well in their exams, and also sitting alongside that it's important that we cover something on how to manage oneself, how to manage the stress of Year 11. So first of all, preparation. And as you can see on the screen, there are a number of aspects to this that I think are worth covering. First of all, what kind of study space is being used? What kind of study space is being set up for students? It is important that they feel comfortable in that study space. Comfortable perhaps, but not too comfortable. For some youngsters, they'll say, I work best while lying down in my bed. Well, that's certainly comfortable, but there's a real danger in that the student will end up being confused about what they're doing and end up sleeping rather than studying. But it is important that the environment is one in which that student is happy. It is important that the environment is one in which your child is comfortable and calm and happy to work. So as you can see from that simple diagram there are some important features of that. It's about being organised, having the right things there. It's about the lighting, preferably some natural light, but certainly good light to work at. But it's also about making sure that there is a space which is specifically for work. That's the real reason why not revising in bed is a good idea, because this is a space that when your child goes to, they know that the purpose of that time is to work. They need to know what they're going to do when they get into that space. So having some sort of plan for the work that they're going to do is really important. They need to be drawing that plan up. It's really important that that's a realistic plan, that this is something that they feel they're going to stick to, not something that you're saying this is what you really ought to be doing. They need to have enough detail on there so that they're clear that they are revising all of the subjects that they need to be doing. There's always a trap that says, I'm going to spend the time just on the subjects that I enjoy, I'll do the others later, when in fact what that really means is, I'll never get round to the others. On the other hand, a revision timetable or plan should not include all the detail of all the different topics. It shouldn't be breaking things down by 5-minute or 10-minute blocks. I'm going to revise this first and then this, because actually that kind of plan takes so long to produce that the classic error is to write the whole plan, then discover that you haven't got the time left that you thought you had and have to start rewriting the plan. So the plan should make clear what time of the week they're going to be studying, how much time they're going to be spending on a given day studying, and it should make sure that they're covering all the different subjects that they need to be covering. So distractions, the bane of any decent work. Some of these are much more straightforward than others. So let's start with those. Television. Working in front of the television is not working. Students who claim that they're multitasking and are working while they're watching television are only fooling themselves. While watching TV, it is possible to do some very mindless work, like copying out notes. But if we're going to mindlessly copy notes, we might as well use a photocopier. That is not learning. No work should be done in front of the television. And the same thing applies also to game systems. Sitting and working while also playing a game is not going to work. Most of that child's attention is going to be on the game and not on the work that they're doing. And similarly a phone, and this is the one where I suspect you may have the greatest battle. There is no reason for a student to have their phone with them when they're revising. If they claim there is a reason for that, we need to overcome that. So, if they say they're using their phone because they need a calculator, buy them a calculator. If they're saying they need their phone with them because that's what their music's on, buy them some other way of playing music. After all, if they are playing music through Bluetooth from their phone, there's no reason why that phone shouldn't be outside the door. A phone nearby is always going to be a distraction. I know this. Students who say, I'm not even using my phone, will often actually be just checking to make sure that no messages have come through. They shouldn't have their phone with them when they're trying to revise. So those three are relatively clear. The others less so. Music. It seems clear to many of us that we work best without distractions and so with no music. But actually for many teenagers, music does help them to relax and does help them to concentrate. It's really important to think about what sort of music is appropriate though. Music with lyrics is generally a big no-no. To tell a brief anecdote, my wife has an encyclopedic knowledge of 1980s pop song lyrics. She doesn't have the same knowledge about the subjects that she studied for her A-levels. I suspect she was spending too much time singing along to 80s pop songs and not enough time really concentrating on her work. If students are singing along or listening to lyrics, they're not concentrating on their work. So music without lyrics might be okay to help them to relax. Music with lyrics, much less likely to be so. Snacks. Well, it's important to be eating well and to be drinking while one is working. But if I say I'm going to revise for an hour and then I spend the first 10 minutes preparing myself a cup of tea and cutting a slice of cake, and the last 5 minutes clearing away my plate and my mug, I haven't done an hour's revision. So this is somewhere where you as a parent can very definitely help. If there's an hour set aside for revision, send them to do the hour's revision and make them a cup of tea. And finally, perhaps the most complex of all, friends. Friends can be both the greatest distraction from revision, but also the greatest support for revision that a student will have. You need to be judging that yourself. Is this a friend or a group of friends with whom your son or daughter is going to be working hard, or are the friends actually acting as yet another distraction or a prevention from them actually working? And the last thing in terms of the preparation is making sure that they've got with them whatever information they need to do the work. Have they got a set of notes? Have they made notes throughout their GCSE course? Are those notes any good? Are they organised? If they've just got a great big stack of scruffy bits of paper, it's highly unlikely that's going to be any use to them when it comes to revision. That's why we come on to the second thing as well. Revision guides may be really important. These show the content of the GCSE and provide an invaluable reference for students if they want to know what it is that they're trying to learn. Similarly, they may need various texts, particularly in a subject like English. They need a copy of the play, they need a copy of the novel that they're studying. They ought to have that with them and prepared in their study area. And finally, in some subjects it's particularly important to have checklists. This is the detail that hasn't been put into the revision timetable. This is the detail of what are the separate topics that students need to cover in order to make sure that they've got a thorough understanding of the whole of the GCSE course. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Wall, who's going to explain about how to learn the important information for GCSEs.
So the first thing that we need to note is that not everybody learns in the same way. There are different techniques and different strategies to suit different people. So please don't be confused into thinking, well, someone else is revising a different way, therefore I've got to do that. And if your children are saying to you, well, the only way to revise or the best way to revise is X or Y, actually encourage them to try out different strategies and different approaches, so that when they actually come in to revise, they know the one that suits them best. They know the one that suits their learning style best and the one that's going to help them to retain the knowledge and do best in the exam. When you look out there, there is no one magic bullet. All the research says that actually it's not about a particular strategy. However, there are some key tips which will help in the learning process. The key thing is to make sure that you are processing information and not just rehearsing it. Any activity which just transfers information from one place to another without doing anything with that information is unlikely to help you in terms of learning it. Research shows that actually, despite what students often think, reading information is the least effective form of revision. Actually, what you need to do is change the format of that information. Now, there are many different ways in which you can do that, but actually changing the style in which it's presented, reducing it in some shape or form, or finding what the key or core aspects of it are just some of these ways. However, that said, just changing the style if you're not actually accessing the information isn't going to be that helpful. So for example, if you are making cue cards, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail later, and you're just transferring the information from your textbook onto a cue card, that won't help the learning process. If, however, you're having to find the relevant information, you're having to condense it, you're having to pick out the bits which actually are the most important, and then just write those key pithy statements onto the cue cards, that will help the learning process. As I said, it's about making sure you are processing the information as you are learning it. The key thing is to use small chunks of time, and actually the more you have breaks in that time, the better. If you are sat down for several hours at a time taking on information, actually the longer you get into that time period, the less you're going to be learning. And research shows that actually short periods with short breaks is more effective than long periods with a lengthy break. Now, there are times actually when you're the night before an exam, for instance, that you do want to be spending quite a lengthy time revising. But again, it's really important, even within that, to divide that time into smaller periods. Also to vary what you're doing, so it's not repetitive, you're not just doing the same activity time and time again. Think of your time in chunks of 15-20 minutes would be an ideal opportunity, with 2, 3, up to 5, maybe 10-minute breaks if necessary, but within that, think about variability. Lastly, when preparing for revision, too many students spend too long producing pretty materials. Now, this can be very nice when you're doing your classwork and you want your books to look aesthetically pleasing, or you want your wall decorations to be good, but actually think about how productive the time is. If your child is spending hours making it look nice, colour coordinating it, then actually the hours that they spent making it look nice, they could have spent learning more information. Often this is about taking pride in the work, but some students really struggle to learn when things are not coloured. So there is a balance to be set here. It's all about thinking, is this going to help me with my learning? If you're making a really scratchy piece of paper, which the words are barely legible, then obviously that's not going to help. But likewise, those pictures, those images, the calligraphy around the outside, is it actually helping or is it taking away from the learning? Are you actually just delaying the bit which is the hard work by doing the bit which looks nice? So, what are some of those learning approaches that we might go for? Well, actually, there are lots and lots, and I'd recommend that actually if you're interested, there's information on the internet about them. You can get study guides which actually talk you through the different ways of studying, and there's going to be more information on the website, a link to this PowerPoint, which helps you to look at some of those strategies. Some of the key ones, which we're now going to look through, are ones which are very common, which students often use and are shown to make a difference. So the first one is cue cards, which I previously mentioned. Again, just to emphasise, it's important when producing a cue card that you are processing, not just rehearsing information. So take your cards, actually take the text that you want to learn or the information that you want to learn, and think about a series of questions. Put a question on one side, or a keyword or a definition, and explain it on the other side. Make sure what you're putting in the card is no more than 2-3 sentences, because if you fill it with more text, then actually you're not going to be able to learn it as easily. This is really effective for when you want to learn definitions, you want to learn quotes, when you want to actually to be able to answer key questions in a short and pithy manner. Cue cards are obviously very useful as well because you can get other people to test you. You can test each other, students can, or you can test your own children. So it's a really good way of making that learning interactive. However, again, it's not necessarily the only answer, and it's important that if you're using cue cards, you're seeing that actually they will just give you a small amount of information. The student still has to be able to expand on that information, and therefore when you're testing them, yes, they've got the answer, but actually as a parent, asking them, so could you explain that? What do you mean by that? How would you put that into context may help in the learning process. So, one example is mind maps. This is a particularly popular one with students, both in our school and around the country, because what it does is create a nice visualisation of the information. The key to a good mind map is to be able to close your eyes and picture what you have written so that it helps with your memory recall. Again, it's all about making sure that you've got concise information, that you have processed that information, and you've put down what you need to put down. This is an example of a mind map which obviously is too cluttered. The problem with this is that actually it's very pictorially nice, but actually where's the key information that you're learning? Make sure that you spend the right amount of time. You're not overcomplicating it, however artistic it might look. Another example of mind map which is too minimalistic. If you're going to make a mind map, don't do it for something like this, because actually that information could easily be learned in a much quicker and a much better way. So what does an effective mind map look like? Well, actually I'd suggest an effective mind map is like one of these. Actually what they have are the key elements, the key strands, and from each strand there is information that explains it, but also you can see that there are links between the different strands. In creating the mind map, you've had to think about the content and gone through the process of actually condensing it, but also by thinking about how it links with each other. A good way to do this is to write everything you know on post-it notes, then actually start to collect those post-it notes which are in common with each other, and maybe to think about why do you categorise those together. They then give you the strands for your mind map, which you then produce. Post-its or posters are another good way of learning. Sticking things up around your house. Now, if you've got very valuable wallpaper and you don't want it to be damaged, then obviously this can be a bit tricky. But actually, encouraging students to stick posters and information around the house can be a really effective revision tool, because then you can revise as you're going about your daily business. It's not just about sitting down and having that 20 minutes of core time, but all the time you are learning information. I taught a student a couple of years ago who actually, what they did was they put big posters up around their kitchen, and it was for their geography work, and as they were learning they were associating different elements of the room with the learning process that they were going through. And therefore come the exam when the questions on volcanoes, they're able to think, yes, volcanoes with the fridge, and picture the fridge. Now why does this work over a normal method? It's because actually you are able to visualise very easily those things which you see on a day-to-day basis. You're able to visualise your kitchen, for example, very clearly. And so if you've associated certain key bits of learning with certain things which you already know well, then that helps the learning process. So sticking posters and sticky notes around the room is really helpful for students to learn, because actually then as they're going around their daily business, then they're seeing these images, particularly things like languages, actually labelling things up in the house. So you know, what is the Spanish word for bedroom? Actually see that in the bedroom. What's the Spanish word for kettle? Stick it on the kettle or what have you. But then rather than just using that, every time they're therefore using that implement or they're in that place, ask them to say what the word is, and perhaps ask them a question about it. Ask them how they might use that in a sentence. So again, it's not necessarily just the item itself that has the learning benefits, it's what you then do with it further. And this leads us on to the next one, which I think personally is probably the most important one for parents to do, and that's discussion and explanation. Actually, what you can do is constantly ask questions. You can be that one-to-one question which they might not get in a classroom environment. When I was studying for my A-levels, I bored my grandparents senseless by going in each evening and they would just ask me to talk about my learning and what I'd learned, particularly for something like my A-level history. And what I was able to do was tell them. They probably knew it off by heart by the end of it, but each time they would ask me different questions and to explain it in different ways, hence getting me thinking and processing the information. This is where you can really come in. Ask them about their learning. Get their list of topics and ask them to explain a topic at the dinner table. Ask them to explain what they mean by it, how they would use it in the exam. Pick a literary text that they're studying in English and get them to come up with 5 quotes from it and tell you what those 5 quotes are. You don't need to know the answer in order to be able to engage in this aspect. It's quite clear quite early on whether or not they're just making it up on the spot or whether they actually have that information to grasp at, as soon as you ask it. So the more you talk about it with them, the more you listen and give them that time, the more they're able to articulate it, and by articulating it, they're processing it, and therefore they're thinking about what is said. Self-review. Actually encouraging your children to be reflective and to review themselves. They've got a list of topics, they know what's coming up, they know what they need to revise. How well are they doing? How well do they know that information? Rate it, if you like, red, amber, green. Green the bits they know well, amber the bits not so well, and green not very well at all. And then encourage them actually to process and to learn the information that is read first. The temptation always for all of us is to go with what is easy first, what we like first, rather than prioritising the bits that we're not so good at or that we don't like as much. Being self-critical and actually being honest in that self-review, not thinking to ourselves, actually no, I'm going to say I know that even though I don't. Could you answer an exam question on that? And like a more interactive style, and actually using recording songs or podcasts is a really good way to revise. Now if you go on YouTube, there are already a lot of revision songs out there, so they don't have to write their own in order to learn this way. However, obviously they're welcome to. The danger of writing your own, as we've said before, is you spend a lot of time getting the words exactly right, and actually it's about learning the information, it's important. But listening to revision songs, or recording yourself speaking and listening back to it on a podcast as you go through the day. Actually, that means your revision is carried around with you everywhere you go. And again, as a parent, if you have some information, you could record podcast-wise some key points for them from the revision guide, and therefore they're able to play those on their MP3 players or phones or whatever device that they use. But this just gives a different way of learning, particularly for those who learn in a more auditory way or in a more visual way. If you like to listen to things, if you know they're very good at learning song lyrics and actually they can quote back songs, then actually this may be a really key one to try out. It can be a bit embarrassing. It's a bit awkward to listen back to your own voice or to record yourself in some style, but once you get over that embarrassment, actually it can be a really effective learning tool and one worth investigating. And the last approach is obviously the use of websites. There's websites out there which are geared towards supporting the learning for children going through their GCSEs, and we would recommend that they use them. For instance, there's things like GCSE Bite Size, which the BBC have. There's things like Memrise, which is particularly important for languages. The teachers themselves will be able to tell the students which websites are particularly relevant for their subject, but actually I'd encourage you to use that technology and actually to explore these in more detail. There's no need for children to reinvent the wheel if there's already information out there that will help them. There are plenty of revision rooms and revision areas on the internet which help students to study. Just make sure that when your child is using them, that it's linked to the correct specification so that they're not learning content which they don't need, or they're not missing out on content which they do need. The third area is application, and the application is particularly important in some subjects. Learning how to answer exam questions is very important. It is not just enough to actually be able to learn the information. You have to know how to apply it in the correct way at the correct time. Students will have done a lot of work in lessons upon exam technique. Therefore, the application element is about practice. If you want to know what exam board and what specification that your child is studying, this information is available on the school website, or if you contact the school, we'll be able to send you it. It's important that you get the right specification, but on each exam board website, there are tons of past questions and also past mark schemes and answers on there. And using this information is really important, particularly for some subjects. Subjects like maths, where actually application is more important than the learning process. Actually practicing and trying and working out the answers is the key element for revision in these subjects. Allowing students also time to self-mark can be really useful, particularly in subjects like science and maths and IT, where the mark schemes are self-explanatory. Students are able to download those mark schemes and after they've had a go to an exam paper, actually take and look at whether they got it right or not. This means actually they're learning by both the marking process but also the doing process. A word of warning, of course, is that in subjects such as English or humanities, this is a lot harder because of the generic nature of the mark schemes. It takes quite a lot of interpretation to work out what mark you got. Therefore, self-marking becomes less important there. Practicing past paper questions is something we would advise, and actually if you do practice them and you want to show them to teachers, all teachers will take as much time as they can to look through them. However, please bear in mind that actually some teachers will have 2 Year 11 classes, maybe a couple of Year 12 and a Year 13 classes, adding up to a large number of students who all want help at the same time of year. If the students are all bringing 5 or 10 exam answers because their exam is the next day, teachers won't have enough time to look at them. Therefore, actually, one of the best things to do is to do a plan for an answer. If it's an essay-based subject, like English or RE, actually plan the answer. Think about what you would have written and bullet point how you would have done it. A teacher can look through 5, 6, 7 plans in the time that would take them to mark an actual answer, and therefore able to give much more immediate feedback and much more detailed feedback more often. So think strategically about how you might do that, but the more you actually plan answers, the more you prepare, the better. The key thing is to make sure you get the balance for each subject. In some subjects, the balance of application is more important. So when you are doing your subjects, such as maths and science, actually being able to apply into practice becomes far more important than a subject like English, where actually the learning has to take a lot of the time first. Yes, you want to practice exam questions, but actually getting that information learned for things like languages is so much more important, because without the information, you can't even think about the application. Whereas in something like maths, actually you learn through the application. So make sure you think about the way in which subjects should be learnt. And if you want any more advice on that, again, please contact the school and we'll be able to support you through the heads of department in each subject about how learning that particular subject would be useful. Mr. Price is now just going to come and talk a bit more about self-management and stress and how you might support students in this case.
So first of all, I'd like to share with you the Yerkes-Dodson law of arousal. Essentially what this says is that if we look at the left-hand end of that graph, a student who has no level of stress at all, is not bothered, is not switched on, will not be performing at a high level. In fact, at the extreme left-hand end, where we're talking bored, a student might even be asleep. Over on the right-hand side of this graph, what we can see is a student who's suffering with too much stress, who also won't be performing because they're too worried about how they're feeling. In the middle, though, is a really important concept which perhaps we've lost sight of, something called eustress rather than distress. Because actually to perform at our best, we do need a certain degree of stress. We need to be concerned about what we're going to achieve, we need to care about what we're going to achieve, and actually students should be a bit stressed. They're in year 11, this is their GCSE year. Actually a little bit of stress is not just normal, it's desirable. It's that little bit of stress that's going to lead to the optimal performance shown in the middle of this graph. For you as a parent, the first question is your child at the left-hand end of that graph? Are they actually so switched off that they're not doing any work? An important part of that is not about managing the student's stress, but perhaps first and foremost about managing your stress. For instance, let's look at this AP on the screen at the moment. Looking at this AP, here's a student who clearly is doing enough. Their attitude to learning is generally very, very good. It's either a 2 or a 1. They've got very high targets, but they're achieving those targets or even going beyond those targets in some area. This is a student who is doing enough. Are you sure your child's not doing enough? Another way in which you can check whether your child's doing what they should be doing is by keeping an eye on Show My Homework. You can see if specific pieces of work are being set. You can see whether they're actually completing those pieces of work because you can ask to see them. Alongside that work, of course, it's important that they're doing their revision work as well, and you'll be able to see whether they're actually spending the right amount of time doing that. So that, of course, is a really key question. How many hours should they be doing? It's important to recognise this is another one of those things where there's not really a single clear right answer. But I know that it'll be helpful if I do give you some indication. So on balance, our belief is that students should be doing around 15 hours of work a week. That's 2 hours every night after school, and then around 5 hours at the weekend. That's 15 hours of actual work time. As I said earlier, that's not time making a cup of tea, or sitting on the phone, or preparing to work, or thinking about work, but actually 15 hours of work. Now it does vary from student to student. Some students will not be able to do sustained periods of work and will struggle to complete 15 hours of work in a week. Others, particularly the very high achieving students, are likely to be doing far more than 15 hours a week. The important thing is that your child is doing enough to complete all of their homework, but also to get into the habits of working on a daily basis, because as the year goes on, they're likely to be increasing the amount of work that they're doing each night. One way in which students can spend time working, if they're finding it difficult to motivate themselves, is by attending sessions in school at the end of the school day. Particularly on Mondays, Tuesdays and Thursdays, but also to a degree on Fridays, staff in school are already putting on a number of sessions in different subjects, and students should be attending some of those. If your son or daughter's teacher isn't actually providing those sessions, no teacher is going to object if a child that they don't teach turns up to their sessions. So people should feel free, if they need a bit of help with science, to go along to a science revision class being run by somebody else. Students need to be able to get the support they need, and no teacher is going to object if your son or daughter goes to see them and says, "Can you help me with this particular question?" But if they're finding it difficult to fit in the hours of work, one way to do that is to add in those after-school sessions. So, as I said earlier, the important thing is to be aiming for eustress. A child, a student who is focused, who's keen, who's eager, who recognises the importance of what they're doing, but is working hard in order to achieve that. Are they coping? Are they actually doing well? If they feel that they're overstressed, remind them of what they are achieving. In the same way that you might need to look at their AP to remind yourself that actually they're doing very well, you may need to show them their AP to say, look, your teachers know what they're talking about. They say you're doing well. They say you're coping. Look at what you're actually achieving and believe in yourself. It's also important to recognise that there are ways to ensure that they do manage to stay in the eustress part of that graph rather than moving on into distress. So as Mr. Wall said, making sure that they take rest breaks at appropriate times, that they're not attempting to work for 6 hours a night straight without getting up from their desk. Social activities are important, well-planned social activities that don't interfere with the revision that they're trying to do, but actually are supporting them by making sure that they're fresh and keen and eager at the times when they are doing their revision. Being clear with themselves about, is this revision time or is this social time, and not a combination of the two. Exercise is important at all stages in our life to keep us healthy, but particularly at times when we're getting stressed. We all know that when we're getting stressed, two things that can go to pot are both our exercise regime and our diet. You as parents can help to control this, encouraging your children to keep going with the activities that they're doing, taking regular exercise and also eating well. Just a healthy, balanced diet. The same food that would always be healthy, but making sure that they are eating well, and neither falling into the trap of skipping meals because they're stressed, or eating too much because they're stressed. Eating well rather than eating junk. And relaxation. Whatever it is that your son or daughter does to relax, do that. Do some revision and then relax. Spend a bit of time working and then spend a bit of time doing something else. Again, as I said before, making sure that you're clear, is this work time or is this relaxation time? Because it isn't both. Unfortunately, of course, for some youngsters, and this may be your son or daughter, actually eustress does slip over into distress. You will know this. You are the person who knows your son or daughter best. It's sad but true that stress levels are increasing for young people. We're aware that there are increasing numbers of young people who are struggling with issues such as depression or self-harm, who are struggling just with the daily pressures of being a teenager. You're the person who's best placed to keep an eye on your son or daughter and see whether that's the case for them. That won't all be about the fact that they're in year 11 and they've got their GCSEs. Although that is a stress, it's the combinations of different stresses that cause us to really struggle. Stress becomes a problem when our perceived ability to cope is not enough to cope with the perceived demands put upon us. So be aware that your son or daughter might also be suffering from other sources of stress. How are their friendships or their relationships? How are their relationships within the family? Don't forget, not only are you the greatest support for your child, you may also be one of the key stressors in their life. And if things get really bad, please do ask for help. As I say, there's clear evidence that stress is increasing for young people, and there is support out there. That might be the case that you need to take your child to the GP if they're really struggling with stress. And if you're unsure, do speak to us in school about whether there's any extra support we can put in place as well. But overall, I don't want to finish by talking about distress. We're all aiming for the same things. Clearly you're doing absolutely the right thing by watching this video. And in the end, we're aiming for this scene at the end of the year. Although I've never seen students get their results and jump in the air with joy, it's very much this traditional image we're aiming for. They're doing the right things, you're doing the right things. It's just a case of keeping it up through this year so that we can all really celebrate with them next August. Thanks very much for watching.